This week marked the end of an era at Starbase, with Ship 30 becoming the final Starship to light its engines at the launch site. And with crews tearing down testing equipment at the site, Ship 26 finds renewed purpose as SpaceX sends it to Massey's to prove out the new test stand and flame trench. Now let's dig into this week's update. Having validated both of its propellant tanks, Booster 13 made its way back up from Massey's to the build site on Friday, moving up Highway 4 and pulling in at the main gate before heading into Mega Bay 1. Once inside, the booster was attached to one of the overhead cranes and readied for placement on the work stands to be outfitted for static fire testing. Over at the launch pad's testing complex, Ship 30 was disconnected from the 2-point ship lifter on Test Stand B. A Pathfinder barrel section with a new lower profile tank dome was taken to the Sanchez site where it will likely be scrapped. After a few hours of preparation, Booster 13 was lifted off of its transport stand and set down on the middle work stand in the back of the bay. At the new parking garage, the top level walls for the garage's staircase were put in place. The booster thrust simulator stand, used to verify the structural integrity of Booster 13's lower dome under flight loads, departed Mega Bay 1. It was carefully maneuvered around cars and construction equipment as it slowly lumbered towards Highway 4. Once the stand was on the highway, it was a quick journey to the Sanchez entrance, where the stand will remain in storage until Booster 14 is ready to roll out. After raising the stairwell walls, temporary support struts and permanent bridging beams were added between them. With Ship 30 secured to the stand now, SpaceX's LR-11000 was relocated to the orbital tank farm, ready to resume work on the propellant farm modifications and clearing the way for a static fire testing at Pad B. An unexpected structural support plate was affixed to one of the Starhopper's legs to serve as a mounting point for new hardware. More top-level panels were installed at the parking garage throughout the day, and work began to expand the footprint while the parking decks were filled in. The launch tower's 2 chopstick arms were put through the paces, working together to check their full range of motion for the first time since the port actuator was replaced. The booster cap, which was used to weatherproof Booster 13's actuators and systems during proof testing, was removed from Mega Bay 1 and put in storage at Sanchez. Early on Saturday morning, workers installed a new mast on Starhopper, attaching it to the plate that was added to the leg earlier. Once it was in position, the mast was welded in place. Making use of the LR-11000, the remaining jagged section of the disused water tank's shell was removed and staged for scrapping. The bridge crane testing tray, laden with counterweights, was brought into Mega Bay 1 on Sunday. Over at the launch complex, a weather station and camera tower were installed on Starhopper's new mast. Starship 30 deployed its flaps for the first time on the test stand, starting with a partial extension before moving to their full spread. After several months in the rocket garden, Ship 26 was finally loaded onto a self-propelled modular transporter. Inside Mega Bay 2, the ship lifting squid was attached to the overhead crane. Since Ship 26 is not intended for testing re-entry, it won't be needing thermal protection, and it still has lifting hardpoints in the nose cone. Later in the afternoon, the ship began its journey heading down the road onto Highway 4 before turning back in at the main gate and heading into the bay. Over at Test Stand B, Starship 30's flaps were given individual checkouts, with each one running through its range of motion. Inside Mega Bay 2, workers began attaching the ship squid to the lifting hardpoints on Starship 26's nose. 3 hours later, Ship 26 was lifted off of its stand and placed on the center workstation, which was recently vacated by Starship 30. Late in the evening, the bridge crane testing tray was removed from Mega Bay 1. Daylight on Monday morning revealed that the ship's static fire stand had been placed over the flame trench at the Massey Outpost at some time since the previous afternoon. That same morning, installation began on the 4th level of the parking garage's deck support beams and outer wall elements on the southwest corner. Glaziers completed the installation of glass on the top course of the Star Factory expansion's southeast wall, leaving the windows along the highway and the southwest side before the glass walls are complete. With the static fire attempt scheduled for Tuesday, the continuous flight auger was relocated away from Test Stand B. At the orbital launch pad, the ship quick disconnect arm on the launch tower performed an extension and retraction test. Continuing the buildup of Ship 30's static fire test, the 2-point ship lifter at the launch complex was relocated to the SPMT storage yard. After a short stay over at the flame trench at the Massey Outpost, the ship's static fire stand departed the test site, heading down Highway 4 towards the build site. The stand arrived after midnight on Tuesday, navigating the tight confines of the build site entrance before setting down in the ring yard. Booster 14's carbon dioxide tanks, which are used to purge the engine bay with inert gas during flight, were staged outside of Mega Bay 1. A 3-ring barrel section labeled MB2 Dev Assembly was rolled into the build site and brought to Mega Bay 2, pausing outside for a short while before being set down in the right side of the bay. This will likely be used to calibrate and test the new robotic welding station that was moved into the bay a few weeks ago. At the launch complex, Starship 30 began its tanking operations. However, the operation was aborted partway into liquid oxygen tank filling and the vehicle was detanked. Meanwhile, the chopsticks were being tested at the orbital pad, refining the tandem motions of the arms. Taking advantage of the road closure, the launch tower's propellant lines were purged, filling the launch complex with gaseous nitrogen. Ship 26's stay in Mega Bay 2 would prove to be a short one, with the new ship's static fire stand being brought in to take the ship to Massey's. Workers quickly began preparations to move the ship, lowering the work stand elevator deck to the floor. The ship was then lifted off the work stand and transferred to the static fire stand, with crews using tag lines to help keep the ship straight as it was set down. A few hours later, Starship 26 was fully affixed to the stand and the squid was detached from the ship's nose. Starship 26 now rolled out of the bay, pausing in front of the building before making its way to the build site entrance, giving us an excellent view of the ship. The ship began its journey to Massey's on Wednesday, shortly after midnight, gingerly making its way down the dark stretch of highway between the build site and soon-to-be inaugurated test stand. Ship 26 arrived at Massey's after a 2.5-hour journey and was soon moved over the flame trench. There it will become the first ship tested at the new static fire testing area, which will soon replace the launch site test stand. Back at the build site, a single ring section was relocated to Mega Bay 2. This ring will likely be welded on the top of the 3-ring barrel section that was taken into the bay the previous day. Following the previous day's abort, Starship 30 performed a second and this time successful test, lighting up all 6 Raptor 2 engines for a full duration static fire. This validates the ship for flight on the 5th orbital launch of the Starship system. After 5 years of service, this was the last static fire test to be conducted at the original suborbital pads, which saw the earliest development flights of Starship. Several weeks after the first glass panels went in, the glaziers were down to the final 2 panels, each of which had 1 pane missing. Once the panel frames were secured in place, the missing panes were installed into the frames, completing the glazing of the southwestern side of the Star Factory. With Ship 30's successful static fire test, SpaceX's LR-11000 was now relocated to Test Stand B to take the ship off the stand. 2 SPMTs laden with counterweights and carrying the 2-point lifter headed for the launch complex to take the ship back to the build site. Starship 30's flaps were then retracted and secured with chains to make sure they won't move during the trip. Workers began attaching the 2-point lifter on Thursday morning, moving it around the ship, but seemingly having some trouble. The initial attachment was aborted and the lifter was turned 180 degrees for a second and this time successful effort. Another bridge crane girder arrived at the Star Factory site, bound for one of the halls in the factory. Each assembly line in the hall needs an overhead crane to bear the weight of the various rings and dome assemblies that make up Starship and Super Heavy. Over at the office building construction site, iron workers began raising steel for the north wing of the building, which will be the last of the building's 3 sections. The first of Booster 14's CO2 tanks were lifted vertically outside of Mega Bay 1 and installed on the rocket. The booster has 2 of these tanks, which are used to flood the engine bay and purge any propellants that may pose a fire hazard. The southeast corner of the garage reached the 5th parking deck level, with the rest of the south side not far behind at the 4th level. Another single ring was brought into Mega Bay 2. This will likely be welded on the top of the previously seen single, making a 5-ring barrel altogether. Demolition of the berms at the static fire test stand began in the afternoon, with concrete being broken up over the earthen structure to make way for the 2nd orbital pad at the launch complex. Later in the evening, one of the 2-point lifters was brought out of storage and into the high bay. The 2nd CO2 tank for Booster 14 was lifted vertically outside Mega Bay 1, while the 2-point lifter support stand departed the build site. The tank was then brought inside and installed on the booster, bringing Booster 14 one step closer to flight. Switching over to Florida, Shannon returned to Port Canaveral on Friday after unloading Cargo Dragon C-209 at the naval dock. Following its 13th flight and recovery, Falcon 9 Booster 1073 was laid down onto a self-propelled modular transporter for the trip to Roberts Road. After sunrise, SpaceX support ship Bob towed Just Read the Instructions out to sea in support of the Starlink Group 6-56 mission. Doug then returned to Port Canaveral on Saturday, carrying 2 sets of fairing halves from Starlink Group 6-54 and 6-55. Cygnet Warhorse 3 returned to Port Canaveral with a short follow gravitas and Falcon 9 Booster 1067, following its 19th flight carrying Starlink Group 6-55. Booster 1067 was then set down at the docks on Sunday to be stowed and readied for horizontal transport. Cygnet Warhorse 3 and a short follow gravitas had no time to rest, heading out to sea for Starlink Group 6-57 just 3 hours later. The transporter erector at Launch Complex 39A was laid down for return to the hangar to be readied for Starlink Group 6-56. With 1 day left to go, Doug headed out to sea in support of the Starlink Group 6-57 mission. On Monday, Falcon 9 Booster 1069 lifted off on its 15th flight, launching the Starlink Group 6-57 mission and making a downrange landing on Just Read the Instructions. The cameras retreated to an uncommon sight on Tuesday as NASA personnel worked to condition the crawlerway surface by rolling over it with one of the crawlers. Falcon 9 Booster 1083 was rolled out to historic LC-39A on Wednesday morning in preparation for the Starlink Group 6-56 launch. After rollout, the booster was then inspected before being raised vertically ahead of launch. Over at the docks, Bob returned to Port Canaveral with both fairing halves from the Starlink G6-57 launch. Falcon 9 Booster 1067 finished its stay at the docks and was set down on an SPMT for its trip to the famous Roberts Road. Launching from LC-39A, Falcon 9 Booster 1083 lifted off on its 3rd flight, carrying the Starlink satellites of Group 6-56 into orbit and making a downrange landing on a short follow gravitas. Cygnet Warhorse 1 returned to port with Just Read the Instructions and Falcon 9 Booster 1069 in the afternoon following the launch of Starlink Group 6-57. On Thursday morning, Booster 1069 was offloaded from Just Read the Instructions and set down to the docks for stowage. That evening, Bob was seen towing Just Read the Instructions out again, heading out to Freeport in the Bahamas for a short stay in the dry dock for preventative maintenance. And there you have it, another SpaceX and Starbase weekly update brought to you by LabPadre. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button if you haven't already, guys, and we'll see you next week. Thanks for watching. LabPadre out.